Alright, before I even get going on this, I want to preface it and make a few things clear. First of all, I am not the author of the entries that will follow. All that follows are what is written in a book that a friend of mine has given me. I am not out to tell you my life story, and I am not out to seek sympathy or answers. These are the notes of a friend of mine who asked me to put this in digital format and put it on the internet. With that said, everything that follows is word for word what is transcribed in his journal. I am not really sure how to start this. I don't want to get too much into my background or my history, because to be frank, it doesn't really matter. You do not need to know my name, you just need to know my story. This was the first event that happened to me over the course of a couple of years. I want to get this down so that even after I pass, my experience will at least serve as a warning to others. I hope you listen. I know by now, most people are more than well aware that horror stories tend to be of a rather predictable variety. Every now and again, you will get a story about a human who has gone unhinged and started some sort of blood-chilling legacy, but by and large, we focus on a few traits that are static and only change marginally by cultures. The monsters of legend are always meant to try and repulse, to be something just recognizable enough to be disconcerting. Horrid things that by the virtue of their appearance alone strikes fear into our hearts. These stories often come as cautionary tales or moral lessons. The monster shows up, causes a bloody mess, and is either killed by a hero or else retreats into the shadows. What do these lessons teach? Stay away from abandoned houses. Don't touch the ancient treasure. Don't go into the dark forest. Or perhaps be kind to that old stranger. Sometimes it is don't dig into the past too deeply. It all seems rather trite, doesn't it? Well, their reason for that is, we have as a people conveyed these stories in a way that make them palatable, something we can tolerate without succumbing to the heart-wrenching fear of their truth. Our ancestors very wisely watered down these myths into something that would still invoke a powerful enough emotion to keep us from doing certain things without revealing too much of the origin of these myths. Stories, or rather words, hold a power that most people are simply unaware of, that most simply do not understand, or do not want to understand. It is why I take such care in the words I'm choosing to use here. Not many people ever take the time to consider where the stories about these monsters come from. The odd historian who has a particular interest in mythology or folklore may do some digging, but the average person never gives it a second thought. Fewer than that, people will rarely take the time to consider why humanity is so interested in these sorts of stories and creatures, the sort of macabre fascination we have that keeps us always circling back to things that are meant to scare us. Don't you find it interesting that some fears transcend time and generation? Snakes, spiders, sharks, heights, the dark. These are all seemingly inherited fears. There is a theory of genetic memory that a good number of scientists are working to prove, that our very DNA can hold memory from our ancestors to help keep us alive. Things like cliffs, obvious predators, venomous and poisonous creatures all seem to be innately something we shy away from. These become almost archetypes in the realm of horror. These traits and features that are meant to trigger something in us play on a part of the brain that's long buried beneath rationality and conscious awareness. Can you briefly call to mind a type of monster that truly scares you? One that is aside from the listed animals? Perhaps a black slimy thing that slithers along the floor and walls that is seen only to you? Or a hulking beast with needle teeth? It might take the form of a human, but distorted, pale white skin, sunken black eyes, maybe hairless or covered in thick, coarse fur. Some of these have obvious connections. Pale skin and sunken eyes are related to death and the decay of our bodies. Disease and illness that comes with them is likely what sparked that. The traits of animals like long claws and slobbering maws are pretty clear as well. Perhaps I am being too indirect with my meaning here. These fears that seem universal, that cross culture and generation, all have things in common. In particular, one thing that manifests in countless ways. They are grotesque distortions of what we know of as life. They are malformed entities that are just recognizable enough to register with our brain, but clearly and almost mockingly distorted to strike us. These things, whatever they are, have been fashioned to be this way, to be something our mind knows and yet does not understand. It is part and parcel to the nature of these things and where they come from. Now, this is where we come to my story. I need to share it. I need to get this out. And while it may seem too fantastic to believe or be trusted as real, it was a very real experience to me. Even the thought of telling this story makes my stomach turn and my head pound. But I hope that by explaining it, I may be able to help myself cope with the stress of the nightmares it has left me with. 3 years, 6 months, 15 days. That's exactly how long it has been since I made the unholy mistake of questioning where these monsters came from. It was my 21st birthday, and like most people around that age, I was just too damn smart. I knew how to handle myself. I knew how to do research into shit before I committed. I was prepared for anything. I was untouchable. I mean, hell, I grew up with the internet. And more than that, I knew how to navigate to the dark web and find information that wouldn't be normally available, and I could do that shit safely. So of course, I would be able to study up and prepare for anything. I'm sure by now you understand the level of hubris I had in regards to my own intelligence. To be blunt, I thought I was prepared. I was wrong. Digging into the occult side of the dark web, I was able to track down some allegedly pretty old ceremonies. These are things from ancient near prehistoric Africa. Legends that had been passed down since the dawn of time and somehow still maintained up through modern day in some circles. It is a ritual that is supposed to let you commune with spirits. I have to put that in quotes because there is no translation for the word that was used. They are entities that exist outside of our realm, our dimension, so to speak. Neither good nor evil, just there. Blithely unaware and indifferent to our existence until we call on them or go looking for them. I need to make an important distinction here. There is a separate word used for their deities and creator entities. The next closest thing that could be associated with it would be the Orisa from the Yoruba tribe. But the word used is still older and disconnected from that particular people's. This is supposedly older by far. But everything with a grain of salt, right? The idea of the ritual was to pull your spirit out of your body and send it along a very specific kind of path to get to this place outside of our understanding. Not just outside our world, but even beyond our spiritual plane. The description of the place was something beyond what even our souls are able to perceive. A space outside of space, if that makes any sense. This ritual exposes you to one of the primal essences of existence, energies that permeate our world from a place outside of it. It is one of the original forces of the universe. Long before life was ever planted on any rock, these energies swirled and mixed. With that said, I will not explain where I found this information. I will not detail how I did it or the materials needed for it. I will give only the barest information so I can better explain what happened. Please believe me when I say it is better this way. So I had gone about readying my basement, the room which would serve as the ritual location. In truth, ritual is not the right word, but it is the closest I can come to explaining it. First, I had to paint a series of rather discomforting symbols in a number of patterns that were quite harsh on the eyes, almost like an optical illusion that never quite came into focus. I plugged in a speaker system and used a CD that the website suggested. It is worth noting the CD was nothing odd itself. just some drums and chanting in a language that I think suspect was close to the culture of the ritual in origin. From what I understood, this was meant to help induce a trance-like state. Supposedly old-world shamans, or witch doctors, would do this for those wishing to go through this experience. Frankly, that bit might just be some fluff a random guy online used to try and sell his music. But I digress. I turned on the speaker and allowed the chanting to slowly fill the room. I had 9 candles, 4 black, 4 white, and 1 that was half and half of both. They were made of unscented beeswax. As it was stated, they were supposed to be made of only natural ingredients. Again, it may be that someone was just trying to sell something, but the way I saw it, in for a penny, in for a pound, right? They emphasized this as critical, as any excess stimulation of the senses could make this more difficult to perform. I placed them within the prescribed sigils on the floor around me, flicked off the lights, sat in the middle of a small circle, and closed my eyes. I turned my attention to the music, letting the rhythmic drumming slowly pulse through the room and envelop me. The chanting and drums seemed to carry away the sounds of anything else, wrapping me in a heavy darkness not only of light, but lack of any other sounds. I sat there, swaying ever so slightly to the music, time ticking by slowly. It felt like hours, and I was losing patience. I don't know if astral projection or a face from the candlelight or maybe some kind of cosmic voice, but nothing happened. I sat until my back ached and my muscles screamed to be stretched. It felt like I was sitting on needles by the end of it. So I stood up frustrated and stretched out. I yawned and arched my back, cracking a few joints. When I opened my eyes, it felt like I had been asleep for hours. I felt groggy, like I had just woken up. Blurred vision with the eye gunk that is ubiquitous with good rest. I wiped my eyes, quite a bit surprised. It surely had not been that long, and I definitely didn't fall asleep. Looking to the candles for some measure of time, I could barely see their light flickering against the darkness. They seemed to barely project any light at all, almost as if the darkness itself was opaque. As I moved to turn on the lights, the candles breathed their last and flickered out, vanishing silently into the void. It took me a moment to adjust to the now undisturbed dark. As I did, I could make out small gray spot-like flecks floating in the air. Like motes of ash or churned seawater, these small floating dots hung suspended, floating on unseen breeze. The longer I stared at them, amazed at the sight, the more clear they became, until they began to shine like tiny, distant stars. I reached out to grab one, captivated by their minuscule beauty. But just like the stars of the night sky, they seemed to be infinitely further away than I could ever reach. The darkness was heavy, thick in a way that seemed to passively absorb light. The tiny pinpricks that glimmered like white embers barely gave me enough light to see the outline of my hand. This, despite the fact that more and more of them seemed to be blinking into existence with every passing second. I looked around, becoming aware that my feet were no longer touching solid ground. It was a sensation I cannot fully explain. I felt weightless, but still held a very distinct sense that below me was a solid floor. I closed my eyes for a moment, attempting to steady myself in this surreal environment. A deep breath to calm my nerves was a poor choice. It felt as though I inhaled hot ash and smoke. My lungs immediately felt as though they were on fire. But I could not cough. My body reeled and rejected violently the sensation of whatever I just breathed, but it would take no action to remove the sensation. The feeling spread quickly, down my arms and legs, up to my head. It felt like there were burning coals just under my skin. After an extraordinarily painful moment, I managed to exhale, like opening a balloon, all the air, and thankfully, the pain went with the breath. When my eyes came back into focus, I was presented with something I will never be able to describe with accuracy. I could not look away, nor could I close my eyes. In this moment, I was frozen in time, facing a thing that defies all sense of rationality. The tiny stars, the flecks of gray light, began to swirl slowly together, all flowing in a graceful dance into an unseen vortex, coalescing into miniature galaxies. They came together in a prismatic display of color and beauty that would be best described by a poet. Iridescent rainbows glowed from these nebulous formations as they joined together in a dazzling display. Colors I have never seen, prior or since, colors that have no name, burst forth brilliantly. The whole ordeal was mind-numbingly captivating, beautiful beyond words, distracting. The far-off sound of drumming slowly danced its way back into me. I had forgotten the music was playing, or I had stopped listening. But it felt like the drumming was filling a void I had not realized was there. The chanting was like a whisper, not loud enough to understand, just soft enough to know it was there. This is when my mind finally grasped the realization this was part of the ritual. It was all going as it was supposed to. It may have only been part of some hallucination or dream, but something in the music kept me grounded, kept me stable in the knowledge that if this were a dream, I had full control over the experience. It was oddly comforting to know this, despite having been so pleasantly captivated by the lights. Trying to play with this sensation, I decided to see if I could do something here. I extended a hand towards the lights, mentally commanding them to swirl around my hand. They did not. The drums became a crashing boom, like a thunderclap that rattles a house. It was felt just as much as heard. The vibration shook the air around me, and me in it. A thrum like a heartbeat from head to toe rattled me. It felt as though a cord had been run through my spine and was plucked by some unseen hand. I was suddenly vibrating like a tuning fork, unable to control the sensation or focus on anything but how penetrating it was. It didn't feel like it was just my body shaking, but my whole being, everything that made me. I blinked and felt a tugging at my chest. It was like someone had grabbed me by the shirt and was pulling me forward. But it was not the shirt exactly. Something between what it feels like when you are grabbed by the skin and by your shirt. You felt it in your body, but it was not your body that was being pulled. This was an undeniable sensation. Something was pulling me. Unease swept through me like a crashing wave. Even though it was uneasy, I can't say I was afraid. I was anxious. Apprehensive, but not scared. Not yet. I had wanted a legitimately spiritual experience for ages, had read dozens of books, paid hundreds of dollars to psychics, all in the hopes that something would happen that would be more than physical, something undeniably mystical. So my nerves were on edge, but not out of fear. At least I didn't think so at the time. Looking back, I think my body knew before I did something was wrong. Then I met it. It defies any mortal attempt to describe it. Words are simply not made to explain things such as this. But I will do my best. Eyes and teeth. A gaseous, solid galaxy of tentacles and spikes, scales and fur, flesh and plasma roiling together in an ever-churning mass of everything and nothing. It was insanity. It is chaos. Its eyes, endless in variety and size, color and depth, seemed to hold all of creation within them. Each one held those swirling motes of light I had earlier tried to command. They gave the impression of seeing everything while seeing nothing at all. Milky, glossed over with eons of time inexpressible. These sensations came viscerally, from a place of feeling. Just knowing by looking at this thing, no thoughts were on a level that could do it justice. these countless eyes held countless galaxies within them. Unending cycles of life and death, creation and destruction. Untold horrors swirling within, just beyond the edges of those pupils. Destruction and horror that man was never meant to know. These eyes, from planet-sized to the size of the tiny motes, seemed to roll in unseen sockets. The ever-churning mass of insanity slowed and came to a chilling halt. The galaxies spun within those optic orbs, spinning away the milky obstruction and focused with pinpoint, malicious intent on me. I struggled, looked anywhere I could, but I was helpless. Floating in a void of darkness, nothing but the dismal light of this thing surrounding me. There was no escaping this. I would wager never in the history books has man felt so unimportant. Not before kings, nor mountains, nor the void of space itself has the utter insignificance of human life ever been felt quite as profoundly as I felt then. I was there, suspended in a place that could not be described, before a thing that should never be seen, and I was aware of just how small our world really was. How small I was. Abject and existential terror are the only words I can fittingly use to describe what I felt. What I saw. Those eyes, endlessly deep, set aside gnashing teeth that could swallow planets whole, were blind, and yet witnessed all things. I felt them, not just looking at me, but taking stock of everything I was, everything I might be. I felt unraveled, unprotected, and unshielded. Vulnerable is just not enough to describe it. These eyes held nightmares and demons. They held monsters. Every horrible thing humanity has dreamed up and endless more. Things with no names. Things that never could be, and thankfully never have been. Dreamed up even in the wildest fits of delirium from the most darkly insane of us. This all happened almost instantly, mind you, so naturally I tried to shield my eyes. A laughable gesture, looking back. But it was all I could think to do. I saw things which felt so close despite being so far, all trying to escape those eyes. They all seemed to know I was there, from within this thing. I held my hand to my eyes, attempting to shield out the lights and ever-shifting colors. I'm sure I screamed, but I don't remember it. There was no more light, and yet I could still see perfectly. There was some sort of negative luminance, a dark light, the inverse of light, and yet not shadow exactly. There was no fixed point of luminescence anymore, but I could see everything clearly. This was not a good thing. It only meant I would be able to see everything that happened. What were once silhouettes of things within the light now became crystal clear abominations within the darkness. And then my journey began. My fingertips began to fray like old fabric that had been worn down to the threads. Searing hot pain followed this unraveling, shooting up the nerves like white-hot lightning. My hand unwound itself like trillions of tiny pieces of string. I could feel my cells pulling itself apart and being sucked towards it. Fibrous membrane, thinly stretched outward into nothing. That is all I was becoming. So fine, so tiny I could not see it as it was pulled away. The lights began to fade from this thing's eyes as the unwinding overtook my body. My feet and my other arm all began to strip down to nothing. The last lights twinkled out as it came to my torso. I could see my cells individually floating away, shredding apart into the nothingness. I knew there was no way I could see something like this normally, that this had to be some kind of bad hallucination. I couldn't realistically see cells being unraveled, but I did. Like spools of thread are unwound, I could do nothing as I slowly became nothing but a floating mess of detached loose fiber, pulled away in dozens of directions. I truly wanted nothing more than for it to end. I would have given anything and everything to escape that sensation. In those moments, Seconds stretched into minutes, and the pain of being unwound was all that I knew. That was my existence. Those moments were burned into my mind, and despite being short, they felt like ages. I tried to look away, to shut my eyes from the phantasmagorical scene. This twisted Alice in Wonderland nightmare, but my eyelids would not shut. I saw the unwinding go up my body, consuming even my head, which, despite having no body left, was still somehow conscious of it all. I had to watch my body float away, like strands of hair down a river, my sense of being detached from the thread that was my body. I was able to watch the top of my head unspool and fade away from outside my own body. I allowed it to finish. I could not scream or cry. All I could do was allow the end to come. In the same instant that I was aware I no longer was, I came back. The very moment I was gone, I was returned. And this time, before me, I was face to face with myself, or rather, a mockery of what I looked like. This fake me floated with its back towards the interstellar monster. This version of me was wrong in so many ways. A blatant insult of what humans are. The eyes were inverted, and the pupils held a faint white light. The iris was some kind of iridescent color that has no name, and the rest of the eye was black. His skin was the color of charred wood, between black and gray, that cracked like desert soil parched of water. Under the cracks, a faint purple glow pulsed every few seconds, like a slow, morbid heartbeat. Thin, shadowy tendrils of something slithered out from different points in the cracks, slowly winding up and down the area before vanishing again into the soft purple under his skin. It was a burnt-up caricature of what I was supposed to be. It moved forward, floating as through water, stopping mere inches from my face. His eyes were piercing, examining me with meticulous, cold intent. After a moment of this clinical examination, a sly grin slowly curled on its lips. With a deliberate slowness, it moved its arm up, pointing a finger at my chest. As it did, the flakes of its skin cracked and fell away, revealing more of the light under it, and those liquid shadow tentacles writhing with it. Moving so close I could feel the heat radiating off his face, he looked me deep in the eye and poked my chest with his finger. Then, in a flash of the same purple light that he had inside him, he was gone. Nothing left. I mean nothing. Both he and the thing that was gone, and I was left in a void of black silence. But I felt myself whole again. The relief of that is something you will never know. I breathed deeply, feeling the sensation of air in my lungs. It is a sensation that we all too often take for granted. The feeling of being alive. It was short-lived. In my relief, I made the mistake of closing my eyes. Not that it mattered, I suppose. After all, in perfect darkness, what difference does it make? But when I opened them, I was once again confronted with the cosmic blight. This time, though, I was moving. Pulled by some sort of universal undertow. Little flecks of gray space dust seemed to fly before me, guiding my path towards this thing that defies description. It was only then I was made to truly appreciate the scale of this thing. I was pulled for ages. It felt like years drifted by as I grew ever closer to the massive jaws that looked like they could swallow a galaxy. Those eyes, though, they watched me every second, every vile second. I could see nothing but nightmares and contradictions as I approached closer. This thing was hypocrisy and paradox manifest, no thirst, no hunger. Just a slow, unavoidable drift towards madness. The thing's body seemed fleshy and scaly, slimy and covered in fur, yet made of some sort of solid gas. This thing was contradiction given form, and yet lacking form. Paradox incarnate, given a chaotic, uncaring sentience. As I finally made an approach close enough to touch it, the gnashing teeth all slowed. The churning of its body stopped for a moment and ripped itself open a new jaw. I moved faster now, pulled quickly towards this new orifice. A tunnel of teeth, just big enough for a person, opened, a mouth just big enough for me. It pulled me in, and I lost myself to an infinity that will never be understood by human minds. The concept of time was gone, and I was subject to every kind of torturous hell. The word hell, even in the most dogmatic biblical sense, seems laughable in comparison. Fire and brimstone were far and away the least creative things I was made to experience in that span of existence. The other me, that charred inversion of life, became my personal jailer and master of ceremonies. The creativity of this thing was staggering. There was no end to it. One strange pain after another, forever happening again and again, all at once and never at all. Being pulled away into nothingness, crumbling to dust, burnt alive by icy flames that froze as they charred. These were just a few I experienced. After them, they began to blur into one vague concept of maddening torment. I think it is a blessing that my mind was unable to handle it in truth. It shut down higher reasoning and simply slipped away into the void. I don't know how long it took, but eventually, something snapped me back to awareness. From far beyond came drums and chanting, and for a moment a thought of hope struck me like a fist to the chest. This was all part of the hallucination. It was all just happening in my mind. Some twisted, dark nightmare that felt more real than it could be. The inversion grinned at this realization as if hearing my thoughts. I tried to free myself from this mental damnation, but only managed to rouse a smile from this other me. He touched me in the chest, and this time, he did not disappear. My blood boiled. I could feel it churning in my veins. I cannot express to you what that sensation was. At my pain, it grinned like a child watching a magic trick. My brain tried to send itself into unconsciousness to avoid the pain again, as it had in the previous nightmares. But this thing would not have it be so. He turned his head to the side, ever so slightly, as if to ask, "What's wrong?" I could see the steam rising from my skin as it began to blister and boil, and yet my body refused to die. It took only a moment for the moisture to be gone, and I could see what was happening. My skin dried, flaked, and crumbled into a sick mimicry of the other me. It was making me look like him. I don't know how long this lasted, but I know what followed the parade of torture. This particular event was followed by a display of terrifying significance, and this is why I was subjected to remembering all this. I need you to listen to this. After this, other me had subjected my body to such undefinable evil. It brought us to a field. A wide green field on a planet that is akin to what you see with spray paint artists. Massive planets and suns in the distance, colors of all varieties intermingling, creating what would be in any other circumstance a rather breathtaking view. It spoke in a voice that sounded somewhat distorted, a close approximation of my voice, but as if millions of people were whispering it in unison. "Watch." I felt my own mouth move as it said this, and to this day I'm not sure if it really was the one speaking. On the field, a man appeared, or rather something like a man. A caveman, perhaps. He had hunched shoulders, a massive brow, and was mostly furred. He looked around confused, but relieved. I recognized the look of respite he had, the same relief I felt when I was brought here. Beside him stood, well, a version of him that matched my own dark twin. Charred and disgusting, it spoke in words I couldn't understand, gesturing at the field. Then it was gone and the man was left alone. This man then looked to the spot shown before him and seemed to genuinely concentrate. The air rippled, flowing like someone had cast a stone in water, and small sparks of that damned light swirled out from it. A furred claw reached out, followed by a massive fanged snout. Within seconds, something that could be vaguely recognized as a massive, monstrous wolf had pulled itself from the void. It stood eye to eye with the pre-human, slathering jaws inches from him. It had a massive, ridged back with thick, coarse fur that tapered into a whip-like tail. The man, for his part, was utterly terrified and unable to move. Then, just like that, he and his creature were gone. A second later, another person, similar to the first, appeared and went through the same process. But from his little ripple came a beast that looked something like a fanged Bigfoot. I think you may understand the direction this takes. I was forced to sit and watch everyone, every single one, every monster in the history of mankind, from ancient fears, like little pygmy things that sit in trees, to beautiful human-looking things that lure people to a watery death. Several forms of demons were created here, and some just versions of animals that were already real, but magnified, influenced by personal fears. But these did not happen all sequentially. Many people were forced to repeat creatures. They would pull from the void a thing I had seen previously. In this case, the monster would form, then retreat into the void. This would be followed by their dark duplicate, grabbing them and vanishing briefly. They would return after a moment, shaken and often crying. Then they would start over. Some people took dozens of tries before something new came out of the void. I looked at my counterpart, who had been ever present since the beginning of this nightmarish cavalcade. I understood, but it was not finished. I was made to watch all of them come forth. Every nightmare humans have ever conjured up. They all came from this place, from this thing at the edge of reality. Interestingly, I remember when my sanity began to slip again. It felt almost comical for a moment before I was snapped back to my senses. You must understand, this process took ages. Countless eons passed on this field watching humanity dream up its own nightmares. When they finally stopped, my own version turned to me and said the next and final word in that strange voice. Experience. In an instant, I could feel my mind being torn through like a starving animal looking for food. Claws scraped the inside of my head and shred my mind into tatters. Whatever had been holding my grip on sanity was gone. I instantly was forced to recall everything I had experienced up to now. My own nightmare creations began. Everything I knew, read, feared, thought about was brought up and formed before me. It started with a faceless man in black. All I could do was laugh at the insanity of it all. A white-faced child, eyes wide with manic grin, wielding a knife popped up. A monster with tentacles and eyes writhing around. I recognized it and could only bark with laughter as both of them did what all the other repeat creatures did to the others. They vanished, and my inversion would grab me, throw me some new fresh nightmare and bring me back. Each time was just as awful as one might expect, and yet couldn't hold a candle to the experiences leading up to here. So I could not help but laugh every time I should have died. After a while, I stopped resisting and just let the thoughts pour out. At some point, I realized the planets and stars in the distance had been replaced by those fucking eyes. Those eyes that see everything. Massive tendrils wrapped around the small planet we were on, watching, blithely indifferent to my suffering, but eagerly awaiting the result of my time here. Eventually, it came to an end, and the other me stood before me, that smile still plastered to his fake face. The pain was finally over, but the job was not finished. He didn't say anything, but I understood what was next. The eyes blinked away and I was left with him alone. Now I have to make a new one. He shook his head, his grin widening. On the distant end of the field, I saw a large group of people starting to appear, just normal, average people. They seemed confused, and all ranged in age from young to old. No one thing seemed to bind them together save their confusion as to where they were. He pointed over my shoulder then, and I saw a single eye on the horizon, watching unblinkingly. The parody of my voice came from him again, the sound of millions of people mockingly imitating one voice in unison. "To stay here." He gestured languidly at the eye on the horizon, and not there, due to them. He lunged at me, and before I could react, he shattered against me, exploding into dust and ash. The purple light from his body glowed for a moment before it settled around me and into me. As it did, I felt empowered, untouchable. I don't know how to properly describe this, but I knew I could do things, just about anything I wanted. Immediately, my desire to be in no pain was granted. I felt perfect, no issues at all. The eye on the horizon grew just a little closer. Listen, I'm not going to go into details here, but I must confess this. For me to stay on that field, out of the torture of the eyes, out of the hellscape that had become my life, I had to become the jailer to all those people. I knew somehow that they were real people, not projections, but people taken from the world. Those vanished without a trace, the missing persons who are never found. If there is a God out there, I hope he forgives me for the things I did to stay on that field. Though I suspect if he is any kind of just, he will not. After the sort of horrors I unleashed on those poor people, I suspect even the devil might find me bad company. I was never freed, mind you, just held there in that placid field as long as I had the stomach to do to those people what my own dark copy did to me. I could not let myself go back to the hells I had known, and to be honest, every time I thought about this not being real, the eye got closer. So eventually I stopped thinking about it and focused on my task. It took far too long for me to stop. Ages, really. But when I finally did, he reappeared, the purple light back in his unholy body, and I was made to create my own nightmare. Create. It was a simple command, and after so long stuck here, I had one, an entirely new monster, unlike anything humanity had ever seen before. A special horror that came right from my own darkness. It took no words to conjure it from the ripple of iridescent madness. I merely had to consider what I feared. What would be a new way to scare humanity? Emotions rolled into primal thoughts, and slowly, those took form. Long, black-clawed hands reached out from the lights, digging into the ground. The thoughts seemed to drift from my mind directly into the form of this monstrosity. It took only a moment before it was standing before us. A lithe shadow figure, full of eyes and teeth, amorphous and ephemeral. The other me grinned widely and crumbled into dust, taking his light and my nightmare with him. Then suddenly, I was ripped from the field as soon as it was free of that amethyst light. I was put before it once again. From the countless eyes, the creatures all spilled forth, both the ones I knew and the ones I did not. All of them scattered into the massive emptiness of whatever space this thing inhabited. But I must confess, I do not think it was really empty. I think it was just distant, because I saw my own nightmare child come forth, come right at me, and fly off behind me. There was no resistance to this process. All these entities are being belched forth by this cosmic entity. I slowly began to understand the function this thing served in our world, at least as much as a human mind might be able to. The energy of all these creatures that flew by was dark, vile, and undeniably evil. But the sensation from this thing was primordial and chaotic. It was the birthplace of nightmares, of all monstrosity, but only given form by minds too curious to resist looking. Suddenly the thunderous crash returned, and the vibration that sent me here strung again. My body was shaking, and the creature vibrated out of sight, fading into the darkness. Nothing but those tiny specks of light remained as the chanting returned to my ears, no longer a whisper, but as if it were right beside me. The drums beat to my heartbeat. I could not even collect my thoughts before all the lights were gone. I was greeted very suddenly by a heaviness I had not realized I had been missing. The vibration suddenly stopped and things were quiet for a moment. I inhaled sharply and was greeted by cool, refreshing air. This sensation, unlike last time, was real and tangible, and it was something I celebrate every day. I opened my eyes and saw the candlelight all around me, flickering softly in the darkness. The music played in the speakers, just loud enough to be heard. I shot upright, jumping to my feet. My body felt fine, not an ache to be felt, nor scar to be seen. Immediately I turned on the lights, turned off the music, and blew out the candles. All the symbols I had previously painted on the floor were gone, leaving not a single sign of their having been there in the first place. The candles had barely collected a single drop of wax down their sides. The CD was barely starting track 2, and my heart was pumping wildly, but pain-free. My breath came in heaving gasps, more out of fear and shock than a genuine need for it. If I'm to be honest, my body felt even better than when I began the whole ordeal, but my head was aching with a deep, dull throb. I didn't want to close my eyes for fear of ending up back in that place. But eventually, I had to. I closed them hard and rubbed my temples while I said a soft prayer to whatever God might have been listening. Opening them did not reveal any nightmares, nor any immediate transportation. I was still in my basement. A cold breeze blew through the room, drawing my attention to a ground-level window that had been opened from the inside. At the edge of the window, a charred print of what could only be described as a claw was stark black against the cold gray of the walls. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran up my spine as I understood fully what this meant, what I brought back with me. Since then, I don't fear the darkness. It doesn't hold anything worse than I've already experienced. In fact, it seems quite welcoming now, almost like a warm blanket on a winter's night. I don't think I ever have to fear what is in the dark again, after what I did. The darkness feels comforting to me, like I belong in it more than I belong in the light of the sun. Regardless, I wrote all of this. I relived this nightmare so you could get this warning. I saw him, waiting in a place outside our universe, somewhere deep in the realms long forgotten, or rather, long since covered up. Deep in the core of chaotic creation, he gnashes his teeth and watches with eyes that cannot see. He waits for a time when his kind will roll like a tidal wave across the plains of existence. The things I saw he will show to anyone foolhardy enough to go looking, anyone demented enough to want to know. Azathoth is still there, bringing forth untold blights into the universe. And all it takes to call them forth is to simply go searching for them.